Good afternoon, everyone. We'll just give you a couple more seconds to arrive. I know more people are trickling in. Thank you so much for deciding to spend this beautiful August hour with us today. I know we have about 90 people signed up for today's event, which is wonderful. If you have friends who couldn't make it, please let them know that the webinar will be recorded and shared in the next few days. Um, I'm so excited to start the HRC program this year. This is our first event of the year, and I'm super excited to welcome our colleague from history, Dr. Andrew Crislip, to start on a very strong note. My name is Christina Stanch. I'm a professor of English and the director of the Humanities Research Center. As you probably know or will find out soon from our upcoming newsletter, stay tuned for Wednesday or so. The Humanities Research Center has a lot of events this fall. You can see the list on our website, on our brand new website, I should say. Thanks, Ellie, for posting that. Before we get to today's event, I would also like to put on your radar our second Humanities Week at the HRC in collaboration with the College of Humanities and Sciences, which will be in October between the 20th and the 24th. If you don't already receive our newsletter, you can sign up at the link in the chat. So now on to today's event. Our Meet VCU Authors series, as many of you know, I know we have lots of regulars on the call, invites our colleagues and students from both VCU and other universities to meet VCU authors as they talk about their recent publications and as they answer questions about their work. Because of our continued success with this format, we decided to preserve the webinar format. Our attendees also hail from many states in the United States and also from abroad. Meet VC Authors is also a time of celebration because publications, as you know, I'm sure, take many years to complete. And today's event is quite similar to our previous events in that I will first introduce our guest who will speak for about 35-40 minutes. Then we'll have ample time for question and answer. And if you have forgotten since the good old Zoom times 5 years ago, we ask that you please use the Q&A function or the chat function to post your questions even during the talk, and we'll fill them in the order in which we receive them. So now it is my absolute pleasure and honor to introduce our esteemed colleague, Dr. Andrew Crislip, who is the chair of the Department of History and the Blake Chair in the History of Christianity here at VCU. He's also a recent member of our HRC Faculty Advisory Board and one of the co-directors of our newly launched Humanities Lab, Spirituality, Care, and Culture. Dr. Crislip is the recipient of many awards, including a Fulbright Scholar Award to Finland between 2018 and 2019, an HRC Residential Fellowship in Spring 2018, and also he's a recipient of the VCU College of Humanities and Sciences Excellence in Scholarship Award 2011-2012. His work really doesn't need an introduction for those of you who have been following it for years. At the moment, his work focuses on Egyptian monasticism, ancient healing traditions, and the history of emotions, through which he explores Christian approaches to passions within the context of ancient philosophy and medicine and the interdisciplinary and cross-cultural study of emotions. His previously published books include titles such as Selected Discourses of Shunut the Great, published by Cambridge in 2015, and Thorns in the Flesh, Illness and Sanctity in Late Ancient Christianity, published by University of Pennsylvania Press in 2013. He's currently co-editing a new book series for Routledge on religion, medicine, and health in late antiquity. He has published extensively articles in journals such as Harvard Theological Review, the Journal of Biblical Literature, and the Journal of the Bible and its Reception. Pardon my my old Latin now, Studia Patristica, and Vigile Christianae. I'm sorry if I've messed this up. He's the author of two forthcoming books, one in November, one in February of next year, because it's always better to publish two books at a time than one, right? The first one, his newest book, is Emotions in Early Christianity, the one coming up in February, and Ascetic Passions, Emotions in Early Christian Egypt, forthcoming in November. This fall. Dr. Crislip, congratulations on your forthcoming books and welcome to Meet VCU Authors. It's an honor to have you.
Thank you so much for inviting me and hosting this great event. It's really exciting to be able to talk about this with people around the world, even from Qatar, just posted in the chat. So let me share my screen and we'll get started here. Very good. So there we go. Of my many hours in 1980s United Methodist Sunday schools, summer camps, and youth fellowship, I can remember one hymn vividly, and it's "They'll Know We Are Christians by Our Love." It's also known as "We're One in the Spirit." At the time, and the lyrics are up here, when I used to sing it, I heard the song's evocation of Christian love as a call to action. And this is the clear message of the lyrics, which share broadly in the 1960s revolutionary ideas of justice and reconciliation. Love forms a core of Christian identity. Love is an action, it's a practice, it's a way of life, and a form of universal philanthropy that the Christian sends out into the world. And you can see this from the lyrics. Yet love in John's gospel, which is the text from which the hymn draws its inspiration, love actually there takes a different form. Jesus instructs his disciples that they're not going to be able to follow him where he's going. Instead, as something of a consolation, they are to love one another. I give you a new commandment, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you should love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples if you have love for one another. There's several important interrelated points in this passage, but I'll note just two. This new covenantal love, a binding love, quite in contrast with the 1960s reception, is not directed toward the world and not directed toward outsiders, but is directed to other disciples of Jesus, against the world. Further, it's by this interiorized affective love of other disciples of Jesus that they will be recognized as distinct and different by others and from others, recognized as who they really are. So John, thus, is promoting a vision of his community as defined by a distinctive way of feeling. The emotion of love, agape, is a new commandment directed toward other members of the community, even constituting the community. Their peculiar love distinguishes Christians from the emotions of outsiders, so distinct that even outsiders will perceive the difference and recognize Christians immediately, not by their creed or their rituals, but their emotion. In this sense, this foundational gospel from the late first century urges its readers to identify themselves as an emotional community, to use an important concept from the history of emotions. To be a Christian is to feel like a Christian. Now, first, I want to talk a little bit about what an emotion is or what it entails socially, cognitively. How do we feel an emotion, and how is this a subject for historical analysis? So I'm going to take just a few minutes to give a sense of my approach to these questions, because they are really, really lively questions in the history of emotions, psychology of emotions, and neurobiology. So first, contemporary scientific approaches to emotion kind of can be divided into two basic schools of thought: the basic emotions approach and the constructed emotions approach. The basic emotion school posits a core set of basic emotions shared by all humans. Now, researchers debate which ones and how many, whether there's 6 or 7 or 8. And here's the classic six form from Paul Ekman. But crucial to this approach is that these emotions exist as natural kinds. They exist independently of our awareness or knowledge of them or observation of them, and they can be localized to areas in the brain and body. These emotions are something like neural circuits or affect programs that have evolved in humans over many millennia and are shared in various degrees by non-human animals. So a snarling dog feels anger like we do, a cat fleeing under a car feels fear, a spinner dolphin flipping over the water feels pleasure or happiness. So basic emotion psychologists find compelling evidence for this universality in these facial expressions that you see on the screen. And there have been lots of these studies carried out worldwide, which claim to show that while words and display rules may change among cultures, humans the world over reliably recognize facial markers of the core emotions, such as disgust, sadness, and anger. Ultimately, all humans, in all cultures, in all times, the thinking goes, share these basic emotions. It's an explicitly universalist account of emotions, and it's rooted in decades of clinical research. And this is the inside out model of emotion, if you've seen those Pixar movies. The other main post-war approach to emotions, which I prefer, differs considerably in its methods, terminology, and perspective. Emotional construction, also sometimes referred to as psychological construction or at one point the conceptual act theory, has taken the foundational evolutionary insights of Darwin in a fundamentally different direction. The theory of constructed emotion denies that there are any innate, discrete, or universal emotions. And emotions cannot be localized to any part of the brain. While there is no doubt that the brain makes the emotions, or that the emotions we feel are real, there remains no evidence that the brain or any other part of the body contains dedicated circuits for affect or emotions, either individually or as a group. However hard one looks for basic emotions, for their physiological markers, their networks or circuits, their shimmers, intensities, or stickiness, there's simply no emotions to be found. Emotions in this theory of constructed emotion are not things in the world or in our body, but are concepts. So an emotion in this perspective is not a feeling or an affect that lurks beneath our conscious knowing, waiting to be aroused by a free-floating intensity or stimulus. And it's not a circuit in the brain or nervous system that's activated or triggered by some stimulus. Nor is an emotion an identifiable amalgam of physiological changes. An emotion is not a natural kind that exists in nature that humans discover, name, and categorize, like the elements. Rather, an emotion is a concept constructed by humans to make meaning out of the complex interaction between bodily affect, that feeling of what it means to be alive, and the experience of perceiving and, very importantly, predicting the world. So it's as concepts, and especially as concepts that we humans use to do things, that emotions have a history. So this is how emotions are made in the constructed emotions theory. Over time, from my earliest experience as an infant until just now, I've been learning and applying concepts to make meaning out of my affective states. That's when I feel a range of bodily states of repulsion and attraction in more or less intensity, formed by factors that I may be unable to isolate consciously, like my blood pressure, and some factors I may be very conscious of, like the butterflies in my stomach right now, or a general lethargy. I might classify those feelings as excitement or anxiety, depending on the situation. Or I might have learned about depression, or melancholia, or ennui, or malaise, and recognize in these emotional concepts what I am really feeling. While there is no circuit or neurophysiological fingerprint for depression or melancholia or feeling blue, these concepts reveal something important about the emotional experience and can influence the course of that emotion. Also important, being able to identify an affective state as an emotional concept is metabolically efficient. It enables the brain to use its predictive power to fill in the context for one's feeling and thus prepare for the future and save precious energy. So, in this sense, emotions are the way that humans make meaning of themselves, make sense of themselves as embodied beings in the world. And what's more, in Lisa Feldman Barrett's words, they are constructions of the world. While all humans share the same biology, the same affectivity of valence and intensity, each society develops its own concepts of emotions, and these concepts change and evolve, which we can easily see in recent history. So here are some recent examples of emotional concepts that have emerged and really become ubiquitous in our society, and one example of an emotional concept that has fossilized. So on the top left of my screen, this is from an illustration in the New York Times. This is a newly theorized emotion called female rage. And there was between 2000 and 2022 a spate of books talking about the power of female rage by Rebecca Traister, Leslie Jameson, many others. And this is a specific type of anger, a righteous rage that is prophetic and just and righteous. So this is a newly theorized emotion. Below that, you've got another newly theorized emotion, exhaustion, okay, which we used to speak of as, well, physical exhaustion, but now exhaustion is much more an emotional concept, as is trauma. Trauma is everywhere, as we know, but the way we speak about trauma as an emotional wound and an emotional process would have been unintelligible 50 years ago. This is a new emotional concept that is immensely powerful. Burnout, another new emotional concept that has become widely used, but it is a concept. There isn't any burnout in my body. It's a way of making sense of some amalgam of stress and affectivity. And finally, this is a still from Lars von Trier's movie Melancholia. Melancholia used to be a very important emotion. Okay, people used to feel melancholia all the time. It goes back to antiquity. But this emotional concept ceased to be useful, ceased to have meaning, and has become fossilized as something that, well, an artist would use. Okay, and melancholia has instead been replaced by newer emotional concepts. First, it was nerves, as in the nervous breakdown, and now it's depression. The basic emotions are no different. They're simply more widespread and of much older vintage. So emotions are so important to our biological nature and to history because it's through these emotions that we perceive and create the world around us and how we make meaning of ourselves and the world. Now, in putting together this talk today, I was looking through my book, Emotion in Early Christianity, and trying to pick out something there to use as sort of a case study. In that book has a variety of chapters on emotional constellations. So joy, sadness, anger, and envy. I picked somewhat arbitrarily disgust to talk about as a case study. I only later realized that for many of us, this is a lunchtime talk, and that may have been a mistake, but here we go. So, disgust, like all emotions, is a concept. It's constructed neurologically, psychologically, and socially through the intersection of bodily affect, mental interoception, that's the way our brain interprets the feeling of our body, and socially through the intersection of bodily affect, mental interoception, and the world we see without our bodies. Okay. Disgust, furthermore, does not get triggered by external stimuli, at least not straightforwardly. Rather, like all emotions, disgust is predicted in our brains by a learning process that continues throughout the life cycle. Disgust can thus be triggered or seemingly provoked by substances and behaviors that are not intrinsically threatening to the organism and revolting by adducing emotional concepts into the brain's normal process of simulation. This is why disgust is such a powerful social force and so relevant to the history of religious movements as recent cognitive science shows, that it shows what we see, hear, touch, taste, and smell are largely simulations of the world, not reactions to this. Okay, so emotions are the way we create the world around us, not straightforward reactions to them. So disgust is fundamentally also a moral emotion. It's a revulsion we feel at others' behavior and beliefs. So, like anger that I just talked about, we use disgust to judge and discriminate between right and wrong and to mark social boundaries of identity and exclusion. So, Paul Rosen, who's considered the founder of modern disgust psychology, has called disgust the body and soul emotion. This is perhaps the more common context for disgust language in day-to-day life. This moral disgust works not just on an individual level, it's a primary way that groups distinguish themselves. We criticize or suspect others for their dietary practices, their norms and sex, their supposed hygiene or lack of hygiene. At the same time, to advocate against feeling disgust is also a way of advocating and enforcing morality and group identity. And here are some recent examples of how disgust works in signs like in my own neighborhood to use disgust language or to repress disgust language in order to draw moral distinctions between good and bad, right and wrong, and to draw class distinctions and group distinctions of identity. And I'll just skip over this for now. Okay. So disgust then is a concept that is implicated in morality, sanctity, and purity, and also in establishing and maintaining social boundaries and hierarchies. So again, Paul Rosen, the psychologist, writes, disgust is precisely the emotion that guards the sanctity of the soul as well as the purity of the body. And while ancient emotion theorists did not include disgust in their catalogs of emotions, disgust imagery suffuses literature of the Roman Empire. In fact, disgust was the very first word decoded recently using generative AI of this carbonized scroll from Pompeii, okay, which you see there. And this was made a big deal a lot by The Guardian and CNN, that the first word they found was disgust. Okay. So I'm going to survey now some of the divergent and competing ways that early Christians approached disgust, its use, and its suppression in the intersection of embodied feeling, metaphor, intergroup boundary settings, and purity. So first, it's striking how rarely disgust language occurs in the literature of the earliest Christ followers, especially the letters of Paul, who was writing in the 50s and 60s. Disgust words are furthermore almost entirely lacking from the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and what terms occur tend to be projective, even as purity remains a theme in some of Jesus's teachings. Now, of course, one need not use exact disgust words like abomination and corruption and so on to indicate a feeling of disgust. So, in this light, more interesting than the use of simple disgust terms is how the Gospels and Paul address narrative situations where the elicitors of core or projective disgust are present, such as bodily fluids, feces, animals, body envelope violations, sexual matters, and disease. So let's just take one example. In 1 Corinthians 5, Paul addresses the situation of a member of his Christian congregation who is cohabiting, sleeping, with his stepmother, apparently without being roundly condemned by the others in the congregation. This perhaps borderline incest is exactly where you would expect to find disgust language. Incest is a prime elicitor for projective disgust cross-culturally, and certainly was in Greco-Roman antiquity. While Paul embraces a rhetoric of purity, that is, he calls for this wrongdoer to be cast out of the church, he neither portrays any disgust on the level of emotion words, nor encourages his correspondents to feel it. Instead, he encourages sorrow. His congregation should have mourned so that the wrongdoer would have been cast out. The absence of disgust in this narrative context of incest is quite conspicuous. The synoptic gospels also place readers in situations where their expectations of disgust might be reversed. And we see this in the sole passage in the synoptics that I think really employs disgust eliciting narration. And that's Luke's parable of the rich man and the pauper Lazarus, who lies at the city gate, quote, covered with sores. This is undoubtedly meant to evoke disgust or revulsion, compounded by the description of dogs who were considered filthy and disgusting in antiquity, licking his open wounds. So the brief description of Lazarus' state incorporates most of the cross-culturally typical elicitors of disgust. You have unclean animals, you have close contact or interpenetration of human and animal, you have body envelope violations, and the consumption of bodily fluids. Yet Lazarus is the hero, transformed from an object of disgust and pity into one of desire and emulation. The pauper ascends to paradise at Abraham's side, while the rich man goes to Hades, where he wants nothing more than Lazarus to touch his tongue with a drop of water. Luke uses this imagery of sores, pus, and dogs as emblematic of the apocalyptic reversal of fortunes. Just as one should not trust in one's wealth, one should not trust one's feelings of disgust, feelings which in Rome as today were commonly connected to a sense of superiority, moral and class-wise. Some contemporary jurists and philosophers have posited a kind of wisdom of disgust. To feel disgust at some action or phenomenon reliably or likely indicates that it is indeed morally wrong. The Lucan parable vividly turns such moral logic on its head, as the rich man's instinctive response to Lazarus's disgusting abjection is proven utterly unreliable. Now, it's instead in the marginal corners of the canon and beyond that one can find the sort of sticky, effective substances of disgust that many seek after in postmodern biblical studies. So the short Epistle of Jude conflates disgusting behavior with the theology of other Christians. Jude signals his interest and disgust by condemning Sodom and Gomorrah and their sexual immorality and their unnatural lust, which is a marker of disgust-based virtue, signaling sort of familiar in many periods of history. The Sodomites and Gomorrans parallel the proximal target of his condemnation, that is, certain intruders intent to pervert the grace of God into licentiousness. They, like the Sodomites and Gomorrans, defile or stain the flesh. They are themselves stains and blemishes on the love feasts, on the rituals of the Christians. Outsiders thus defile and spoil the emotion and emotional practices of the community. The short letter of 2 Peter condemns heretics with the Levitical language of leprosy and cites a psalm to compare them to pigs and dogs because they delight in their own vomit and filth. The short letters to Timothy and Titus proceed in the same manner. 2 Timothy condemns heretical teachings which spread like gangrene. These short, late letters are rich in discussed language, almost exclusively, or I think exclusively, targeting not outsiders, but other Christians who are teaching the wrong thing. So this language of Christian disgust as virtuous recurs in 2nd century theological polemics and afterwards, which elaborate on the motifs of disgust in these texts, focusing revulsion at other Christians, including heretics and apostates. Already by the turn of the 1st century, storytellers had begun to flesh out the death of the first apostate, with or without disgusting imagery. More disgusting than the suicide in Matthew, pictured here, is Luke's version in which Judas falls to his death and is disemboweled. The 2nd century Bishop Papias elaborates on this body envelope violation, kind of disgustingly. After betraying Jesus and setting out to enjoy his new riches, the 30 pieces of silver, Judas's body swells with interstitial water. He has dropsy. Papias does not skimp on the details or the explicit language of disgust, and he uses the word aedes, disgust. Here's just one example. His genitals became more disgusting and larger than anyone's. Simply by relieving himself, to his wanton shame, he emitted pus and worms that flowed through his entire body. As in Luke's version, Judas died on his own land disemboweled, and Papias claims that it still stinks so much in his day that passersby must hold their nose. This was how great an outpouring he made from his flesh on the ground, he writes. So much as apostates prompt core and projective disgust, so do those so-called Christians who disturb and teach the wrong things. That's heretics, as second-century Christians would come to label them. The earliest surviving anti-heretical treatise evokes its readers' disgust to reinforce theological right teachings. So Irenaeus of Lyon, writing around 180, wrote his Against Heresies with a primary target of the school of Valentinus. So early in the first of his 5 volumes Against the Heresies, Irenaeus presents the foundational creation myth taught by the 2nd century Valentinian teacher Ptolemy, who posited that the phenomenal world of perception and embodiment where we live was actually formed out of an ancient cosmic error, which Ptolemy traces to one of the divine heavenly beings, or an eon, in heaven that he named or called wisdom, or Sophia. Wisdom had strained to achieve the impossible. She wanted to gain knowledge or acquaintance, gnosis, of God the Father, and in her failure produced emotions or passions, sadness, fear, disturbance, and ignorance. And she was thus expelled from heaven with her emotions because she was thus then imperfect. This process is then recapitulated outside heaven by another wisdom named lower wisdom, or achamot from the Hebrew. And Ptolemy envisions a world of matter that is bound up with and created through the primal negative emotions of wisdom and akamoth. So he says the seas and rivers, for example, are remnants of Sophia's tears at recognizing her error and her repentance and reacceptance ultimately back into the heavens. Now, this myth was probably quite poetic in Ptolemy's now lost telling, and as strange as it might sound, this was profoundly popular in the ancient world, so much so that Irenaeus devoted 5 books primarily to critiquing his Valentinian opponents. But Irenaeus here does not just use the Bible or logic to poke holes in this myth. He turns to disgust to render the myth offensive. So it's well known that the one bodily fluid that does not generally trigger a disgust response is tears. Irenaeus wonders, surely in her distress, wisdom didn't just cry, surely she perspired as well. If the tears produce the saline waters, according to Ptolemy, then fresh water and fountains, he says, these must be Sophia's sweat. Imagine drinking a cup of someone's sweat. Imagine drinking a cup of Sophia's sweat. That's just the kind of practice that heretics like. And what of hot and pungent waters, he says? The hot springs, the baths. Irenaeus refrains from naming the substance, but the implication is clear. Ye ought to know what she did and from what members these were emitted. Indeed, such products fit in well with their hypothesis. So disgust here guides the Christian better than any theological argument to stay away from the ridiculous and foul heretics. Heretics, too, could meet their end in disgust. Most famously, the condemned priest Arius is remembered as having died in history's worst case of explosive diarrhea, which is graphically described by the church historian Socrates and pictured on your screen. As with Galerius, also in his deathbed on the screen, who, according to the theologian and Lactantius, literally became a sack of shit when he died, much like this, God's judgment is loosed upon the arch heretic Arius's bowels as he rushed toward a latrine, and it had a tragic end. His, quote, bottom fell through along with his excrement. The thing which doctors call the rectum immediately fell out through his bottom, with a lot of blood following, and the rest of his intestines flowed out together with his liver and his spleen, and he died immediately. The moral is clear. The disgust one feels in imagining Arius's wretched end should be projected morally at the teachings he espoused, as well as to those who espouse them. A moral disgust which includes and encourages theological and disciplinary purity. Heretics are not just disgusting. They delight in the foul, especially bodily fluids, which late antique Christians extrapolate beyond biblical metaphors of dogs and pigs returning to their own vomit and feces. In the most extravagant example of this trend, Epiphanius of Salamis, writing in the late 4th century, wrote a theological medicine chest to combat the poison of heresy. His account of the Gnostics employs core and moral disgust that we've already seen in Irenaeus and in earlier sources, but now taken to an extreme. The Gnostics are defined by their pollution and the disgust they elicit, as the devil led them on so as to pollute the minds, hearts, hands, mouths, bodies, and souls of the persons he has trapped in their deep darkness. His account brings together all of the aspects of moral and core disgust that we've seen so far. So body envelope violations, illicit sexual behavior, contact and consumption of bodily fluids, cannibalism, abortion, disease, animals, swarming insects. It's no accident that Epiphanius draws on 2 Peter and Jude and also on Revelation, whose metaphorical disgust elicitors Epiphanius actually literalizes in the ritual activities of the heretical Gnostics. These Gnostics, he says, go by the nickname Borborates, which literally means filthies. And it's an epithet which points back to Jude's characterization of intruders as pigs who wallow in filth. Filth here, feces, is borboros. These heretics are disgusting and they revel in their disgusting behaviors. They are like a disease, a malignant itch, or leprosy. They are like a swarm of insects, infecting us with diseases, smelly eruptions, and sores through their error with its mythology. They are like dogs and pigs, for they dispose of their corruption like dogs and pigs, who are polluted in this way, and yeah, you know how this goes. I'm actually going to skip over Epiphanius's extremely graphic discussion of this ritual, but it is everything you can imagine it is. It is truly, truly revolting. But given that we are at lunchtime, I'll go ahead and pass over it. The point of all this is clear anyway. Virtuous Christians, pure Christians, feel disgust at heresy. Not to feel disgust is to be a heretic, to be disgusting. Now, one last thing here before we take time for questions. This wasn't the only way that Christians in late antiquity conceived of disgust. In fact, ascetically inclined Christians in late antiquity took a different approach to disgust. Rather than encouraging disgust as a moral emotion to draw boundaries between groups, such writers saw disgust much more in line with the attitude that I've highlighted in Paul and some gospel passages. That is, it's an emotion to manage and overcome, which might, through cognition, ritual, and practice, transform the self and the community. So I'll take two examples real quick. The philosopher and biblical scholar Origen, in the early 3rd century, placed a kind of disgust at a critical juncture in his theory of the origin of the world and the descent of humanity into its present embodied and fallen state. In his work on First Principles and in other works, Origen posits an original existence of humanity as pure minds, and we existed in perfect bliss in contemplation of God. Origen drew on earlier Platonic speculations of the descent of souls into mortal bodies, and this idea you can see well developed by Plato in his Phaedrus And this was also taken up by the Jewish Alexandrian philosopher and biblical interpreter Philo. Philo, for example, allegorically interpreted a reference to birds in Genesis 15:11 as souls, which, quote, although they were raised in the air and the most pure ether, they could not bear the satiety, the Greek word is choros, of the divine good things and migrated to the earth, the region of things mortal and evil. Now, this choros lacks an equivalent in English, but the feeling is clear enough. Satiety, or in the Latin translation, satietas, carelessness, lassitude, boredom. It's sometimes also translated as tedium into Latin, and disgust. The disgust here is not a revulsion at something spoiled, but a feeling of excess, consuming so much of a good thing that it loses its appeal and its good taste turns bad. In Origen's theology, there's nothing wrong with the feast offered by God for our rational natures, feeding on the food which is the understanding and love of God. God plays no role in the origin of evil. It was simply the rational natures, that is, us humans, our negligence and disgust, choros or satietas, at the goodness of God that caused us to fall away into this cold, cold world. His view of disgust contrasts with that of Irenaeus, who I mentioned earlier. While Irenaeus mocked Valentinians by drawing disgusting implications from their theories, Origen offered a different emotional catalyst as a solution to the same problem. How did humans end up in a world of suffering and painful emotions with God himself not bearing any moral responsibility for the error? For Origen, the fault lies in all rational minds who would become humanity, who had carelessly stuffed themselves with the goodness of God's love to the point of disgust, a satiety and lassitude which set the whole drama of creation and redemption in action. So Christians in this theological and ascetical tradition encouraged a practice of disgust that didn't foster it as a moral good for dividing insiders and outsiders. Rather, it was an opportunity for moral growth and learning. By overcoming disgust, we thick, stinking, and sticky humans might overcome our embodiment on a journey back to God. And I will sort of, for time, skip over some of this literature, but there is actually a rich vein in late antique Christianity in the life of Saint Cycletica and some other early Egyptian texts that really develops narratively the practice of overcoming disgust through kind of exposure therapy, in a sense, in order to reform the self. So let me just conclude here. Early Christians, through late antiquity, describe common and intuitive disgust elicitors in a variety of contexts, and these include both core and projective disgust: incest, skin disease, body envelope violations, unclean animals, dead bodies. Significantly, disgust can be consciously and unconsciously altered through socialization, persuasion, and mimesis. When Paul reframes the proper emotional response to incest as grief, and when Luke and John reframe proper emotional responses to open wounds as joy and wonder, or when ascetics teach and model cognitive exercises to manage, suppress, or redirect disgust impulses, it not only reflects a difference in diversity of ancient emotional experience, though that is very important, it also encourages among their readers a process of emotional learning and transformation, which takes place not just on the level of discourse, which we can observe, but also through physical changes in the body and brain, which we can't observe. The trend toward minimizing disgust language and imagery in moral exhortation and narrative in favor of emotional experiences of grief, happiness, joy, and awe should be considered an important component of the early Christian movement, inseparable from its ritual, its morality, and its narratives. Yet this shift in emotion, however widespread it may be in Paul's letters and the Gospels and in some ascetic trajectories in late antiquity, This did not become normative among early Christian writers. More influential, I suspect, was the kind of disgust response encouraged by our anti-heretical writers from the New Testament into late antiquity, who embraced a moral language of disgust, identifying others, especially other Christians, as disgusting in their teachings and rituals, evoking a righteous disgust in their readers as a theological and behavioral guide. We will know that they are not true Christians by our disgust. So thank you for persevering through this.